first time I heard the whistle, I was closing up Wilson's General Store in Oak Ridge, Mississippi, just like I had every night for the past 15 years. The sound cut through the thick summer air like a knife, long, low, and mournful. But there was something wrong about it. The L&N line hadn't run through here since 1964, when a tragic derailment claimed 37 lives and the company abandoned the track. I remember that night clearly because it was my 45th birthday, August 15th, 2023. The cicadas were singing their evening chorus, and the humidity hung so heavy you could practically drink the air. Martha, my wife of 20 years, had wanted to take me out to dinner in Jackson to celebrate, but I'd insisted on working late to finish the monthly inventory. "The dead can wait," she'd said with a laugh, not knowing how prophetic those words would become. As I turned the key in the lock, that whistle sounded again, closer this time. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my keys slipped from my suddenly sweaty fingers. The brass key ring, a gift from my grandfather before he died, landed with a dull thud in the dust, right next to a rusted railroad spike I'd never noticed before. The old-timers used to talk about ghost trains in these parts. Miss Abigail, who'd taught third grade here for 40 years, would tell anyone who'd listen about the night she saw the phantom locomotive, its wheels throwing blue sparks as it rolled down tracks that weren't there anymore. Sheriff Cooper's daddy claimed he'd heard the whistle every anniversary of the crash until the day he died. I'd always written them off as tall tales meant to frighten children and tourists. But standing there in the purple twilight, watching a faint glow appear around the bend where the tracks used to run, I wasn't so sure anymore. The light grew stronger, and with it came a rhythmic sound, the distinctive click-clack of steel wheels on rail joints. But the tracks had been pulled up decades ago, the rail bed now just an overgrown path through the pines. Yet there it was, clear as day, the ghostly outline of a steam locomotive, its headlamp piercing the gathering darkness with an otherworldly blue-white glare. I should have run. Any sane person would have. But something held me there, rooted to the spot as the phantom train rolled past. The engine was a massive 482 mountain type, its driving wheels taller than a man, spinning silently now despite the sound of their motion. Steam hissed from its cylinders, but the vapor disappeared before it hit the ground. Behind it stretched a string of passenger cars, their windows glowing with a soft, yellowish light. And in those windows, God help me, in those windows I saw faces. Dozens of them, pressed against the glass, their features frozen in expressions of terror and despair. They seemed to be screaming, but no sound came out. One woman held a small child to her chest. An elderly man clutched a pocket watch. A young couple clung to each other, their mouths open in silent horror. I recognized some of them from the old photographs in the Historical Society. Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, who'd been traveling to her daughter's wedding in Mobile. The Robinson twins, just 6 years old, on their first train ride to visit their grandparents. Reverend Michael Hayes, returning from a Baptist convention in Nashville. These were the victims of the 1964 derailment, still riding that final journey, night after night. The last car was different. Unlike the others, it was dark, except for a single lit window near the rear. As it passed, a face appeared, not pressed against the glass in terror like the others, but calmly observing. It was my grandfather, looking exactly as he had the day before. He died in 1985. He raised his hand in greeting, and his lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. That was the beginning. Over the next few months, the 947 ghost train became a regular visitor to our little town. Always at night, always following the path of the old rail bed. Word got around, as it tends to do in small southern towns. Some folks came to see it for themselves. Most left disappointed, seeing nothing but fireflies and shadows. But others Others saw what I saw, and more. Sarah Jenkins, who runs the flower shop, swears she saw her long-dead mother waving from one of the windows. Old Mr. Peterson claims the train stopped one night, and spectral passengers descended onto our main street, reenacting their final moments before boarding that fateful train in '64. The Henderson boy, all of 12 years old, said he heard singing coming from the passenger cars, a ghostly chorus of "Will the circle be unbroken?" Martha worried about me. She'd wake in the middle of the night to find my side of the bed empty, knowing I was out there somewhere, watching for the train. "You're becoming obsessed," she'd say, her voice heavy with concern. "Just like your grandfather was before he died." That got my attention. I'd never known my grandfather had any connection to the train beyond being a local at the time of the accident. I started researching the derailment, spending hours in the county library's archives. The official report blamed track failure, but there were whispers of something darker. The engineer, Thomas Whitaker, had been seen drinking at a local speakeasy hours before the crash. He survived, only to take his own life 3 months later, leaving behind a cryptic note that read, "They won't let me rest. Every night they make me drive that train again." But there was more. In a yellowed copy of the Oak Ridge Gazette from September 1964, I found a small article about a federal investigation into missing railroad maintenance funds. The investigation was suddenly dropped after the crash, all records sealed, and my grandfather's name was mentioned as a potential witness, who was never called to testify. The more I dug, the more questions arose. Why had my grandfather's name appeared in connection with the investigation? What was in the leather satchel he claimed to have lost on a business trip that same summer? And why had he spent the last years of his life avoiding the old railbed, taking long detours just to circumvent the crash site? One night, about 6 months after my first encounter, I decided to follow the train. I took my truck down the old service road that parallels the former railbed. The phantom locomotive moved slower than a real train, maintaining a steady pace that allowed me to keep up. For miles we traveled through the darkened countryside, the ghostly procession and my pickup truck, until we reached the site of the derailment. The place was marked by a simple granite monument listing the names of the dead, but locals avoided it, claiming the ground was cursed. They said nothing would grow where the blood had soaked into the earth. Looking at the bare patch of ground in the midst of the lush southern forest, I believed them. What I witnessed there haunts me still. The phantom train began to recreate its final moments. I watched in horror as the engine lurched, the cars behind it swaying violently. The screams, dear God, this time I could hear the screams. The entire train seemed to fold in on itself, passenger cars crumpling like paper, phantom bodies flying through the air. But then something changed. The locomotive's headlamp swung around, fixing me in its ethereal beam. The screaming stopped. Every spectral face turned toward me. And there, standing beside the twisted wreckage, was my grandfather again. He beckoned to me, his expression urgent. I got out of my truck, drawn forward by some force I couldn't resist. As I approached, the scene shifted. The wreckage disappeared, replaced by the train as it had been before the crash. My grandfather stood by an open door of the rear car, but now I could see he wasn't alone. Thomas Whitaker, the engineer, stood beside him, his face a mask of guilt and despair. "There's something you need to see," my grandfather said, his voice clear as day, despite being dead for nearly 40 years. "Something that needs to be made right." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The truth," he replied. "About what really happened that night. About why we're still here. About the money, the sabotage, and the lives we destroyed." I hesitated at the foot of the steps. "We. Your grandfather was a good man," Whitaker spoke up, his voice hollow. "He tried to stop it, tried to warn them, but they wouldn't listen. And then it was too late. I noticed something odd. My grandfather was holding that leather satchel I recognized from our old family photographs. He had lost it, he'd always claimed, on a business trip in the summer of 1964. But now I could see dark stains on its surface, stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "The evidence is all here," my grandfather said, patting the satchel. "Everything they tried to bury with the bodies and the wreckage, the maintenance records, the bribes, the letters. It's time for the truth to come out. Time for us all to find peace." As I climbed the second step, the whistle sounded again, louder than ever before. The world seemed to tilt, and I felt a hand grab my arm, pulling me aboard. The door slammed shut behind me, and the 947 began to move, carrying me into a night that would change everything I thought I knew about my family, our town, and the thin line between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The next few hours were a blur of spectral revelations and horrifying truths. My grandfather and Whitaker showed me documents that had been lost to time, proof of a conspiracy that went far beyond a simple track failure or a drunk engineer. Local officials, railroad executives, and even members of my own family had played parts in a drama that ended in tragedy. The satchel contained maintenance reports that had been falsified, letters threatening witnesses into silence, and photographs that showed the deteriorating condition of the track months before the crash. My grandfather had collected it all, planning to expose the truth, but he never got the chance. The night of the crash, he'd been on his way to meet with federal investigators in Mobile. He never made it. The saboteurs had done their work too well. The track didn't just fail. It had been deliberately weakened, the timing of its collapse carefully planned. My grandfather survived by pure chance. A flat tire had delayed him, forcing him to take a later train. But his evidence was lost in the wreckage, and his guilt at surviving while others died had haunted him until his own death. When dawn broke, I found myself standing alone at the crash site, the leather satchel heavy in my hands. The ghost train was gone, but its revelations remained. I knew what I had to do. It took months of work with local journalists and state investigators to unravel the full story. Some of the conspirators were still alive, though elderly now. Arrests were made. Reputations were ruined. Families, including my own, were torn apart as long-buried secrets came to light. But slowly, something changed in our town. The ghost train's appearances became less frequent. The screaming faces in the windows looked more peaceful. And one night, exactly a year after my first encounter, I saw the 947 one last time. It was different now. The locomotive's light was softer, more golden than blue. The passengers weren't screaming anymore. They were smiling, waving goodbye. My grandfather stood on the rear platform with Engineer Whitaker, both of them looking younger, lighter somehow. As the train faded into the darkness, I heard my grandfather's voice one last time. "Thank you for bringing us home." These days, the old railbed is a walking trail. The memorial at the crash site has been expanded, telling the full story of what happened that night in 1964. Sometimes on quiet evenings, people still say they hear a distant whistle. But it's not mournful anymore. Just a reminder that some journeys don't end with death, and that the truth, like a phantom train, keeps rolling until it reaches its final destination. And sometimes, just sometimes, if you listen carefully in the gathering dusk, you might hear the faint sound of wheels on phantom tracks, carrying stories of redemption, justice, and the long journey home.